What if I told you that most of what Americans believe about Australia is flat out wrong? You've probably heard the stories. Kangaroos hopping through the streets, giant spiders lurking in every corner, crocodiles waiting outside your house like unwanted guests. But here's the truth. Much of it is just a mix of Hollywood exaggeration, travel brochures, and internet myths that have spiraled way out of control. And the craziest part? Some of these myths are so deeply rooted that Australians themselves get tired of correcting them. So buckle up, because by the end of this video, you'll realize just how many of these facts about Australia you've been getting totally wrong. Quick question before we dive in. Which of these myths have you believed your whole life? Drop your guess in the comments. I'll be checking to see which one shocks you the most. Number 1. The Down Under myth. Let's start with the nickname that never dies, Down Under. Americans love to throw it around, as if Australians are walking around introducing themselves that way. Hi, I'm from Down Under. But here's the twist. Most Australians rarely use the term. It's mostly a foreign invention, popularized through tourism ads, cheesy travel magazines, and catchy songs. In fact, if you called Australia Down Under in an actual conversation with locals, they'd probably roll their eyes. Why? Because to them it feels outdated, almost cartoonish. Imagine if every time you introduced America, people only referred to it as the land of the bald eagle. Sounds weird, right? That's how Australians feel about the phrase. If you've ever used the term down under, be honest, type guilty in the comments. Let's see how many people fall into that trap. But the down under myth is just the beginning. Let's move to something that Americans really get nervous about when they think of Australia. Number 2, the deadly wildlife exaggeration. Ask an American what comes to mind when they picture Australia, and you'll probably hear, "Oh, that's the place where everything wants to kill you." Giant snakes, man-eating spiders, and jellyfish with names longer than your arm. It's practically a survival horror movie in their heads. Here's the truth bomb. Yes, Australia has some of the most venomous species in the world, but the odds of running into them are ridiculously slim. You're more likely to get struck by lightning in the US than die from a spider bite in Australia. For example, huntsman spiders, the ones that look like they belong in a sci-fi film, they rarely bite humans and actually eat cockroaches, making them more like the friendly neighborhood pest control. Yet Americans share photos of them online like they're proof Australia is a war zone. It gets better. Australians don't walk around panicking about snakes and spiders every day. For most, it's just background noise. Like how Americans don't panic about bears roaming the suburbs, even though they exist in parts of the country. Quick challenge. If you'd survive in Australia for at least a week without panicking about wildlife, drop a snake emoji in the comments. But if the wildlife myths aren't enough, wait until we dive into how Americans imagine the very land itself. Number 3, the all-outback stereotype. Another big misconception is that Australia is just one giant red desert, like a never-ending Wild West movie. Americans picture endless stretches of dusty outback with kangaroos bouncing across the horizon, and maybe a tumbleweed rolling by for good measure. The reality? Australia is mostly urban and coastal. Over 80% of Australians live within 50 kilometers of the coast. Cities like Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane are modern, buzzing, and full of skyscrapers, coffee shops, and tech hubs. Yes, the outback exists, but it's not where the majority live, and it's definitely not the everyday landscape. Think of it this way. Assuming all of Australia is just the outback is like saying all of America is just the deserts of Arizona. It's a complete oversimplification. Australia has lush rainforests in Queensland, snowy mountains in New South Wales, and green wine country in Victoria, none of which fit the dusty postcard stereotype. Be honest, did you imagine Australia as one big desert before? If so, type outback in the comments, and let's see how common this misconception really is. But hold on, if it's not crocodiles on every doorstep or deserts on every corner, then what about the legends of man-eating reptiles sneaking into people's backyards? Well, that's the next myth we need to tackle. Number 4, crocodiles in your backyard. If there's one image Hollywood refuses to let go of, it's the idea that crocodiles are lurking in every Australian backyard. Movies like Crocodile Dundee and viral YouTube clips of giant reptiles only fuel the stereotype that Aussies are constantly wrestling crocodiles while taking out the trash. Here's the reality check. Saltwater crocodiles, also known as salties, do exist, but only in the tropical north, around Queensland and the Northern Territory. They're nowhere near Sydney or Melbourne, where most of the population lives. And while they're impressive predators, they're also carefully monitored by wildlife authorities. The average Australian is about as likely to bump into a crocodile as the average American is to find an alligator chilling in their backyard. Possible in Florida, but not the daily norm. Yet, Americans cling to this idea as if Australians casually wade through crocodile-infested rivers on the way to school. The funniest part? Aussies actually joke about it themselves, creating tall tales like the infamous drop bears, a fictional killer koala story used to prank tourists. If you've never heard of it, Australians tell visitors that koalas can suddenly drop from trees to attack people. It's not real, but the fact that so many tourists fall for it shows how much these myths spread. Have you ever heard of the drop bear myth? If you thought it was real at some point, type "got me" in the comments. We won't judge. But crocodiles aren't the only stereotype Americans get hilariously wrong. The way they imagine Australians speak is a whole other level of misunderstanding. Number 5. Accent and slang overload. Let's talk accents. Thanks to TV shows and iconic figures like Steve Irwin, Americans often think every Australian walks around saying "crikey" and "g'day mate" in the thickest accent possible. It's basically become Australia's global brand. But here's the twist. Not every Aussie sounds like that. In fact, Australia has regional accents, social class variations, and different slang depending on age groups. A corporate lawyer in Sydney doesn't sound like a surfer in Byron Bay, and a teenager in Melbourne doesn't talk the same way as an outback cattle farmer. To lump them all into one crocodile hunter voice is like assuming every American sounds like a cowboy from Texas. And then there's the slang. Americans often think Aussies sprinkle phrases like "throw another shrimp on the Barbie" into casual conversations. Fun fact, Aussies don't say shrimp, they say prawns. That famous line came from an American tourism campaign, not Australian culture. Most slang in Australia is subtle, shortened words like arvo for afternoon or servo for gas station. But the stereotype of wild, incomprehensible Aussie slang is blown out of proportion. Quick game. What's the funniest Australian slang you've ever heard? Drop it in the comments. And let's see who knows the weirdest one. But if the accent myths make you laugh, the next one is even bigger, because Americans love to imagine Australians living in one giant backyard barbecue. And number 6. BBQs, beaches, and beer. This one's classic. The image of Australians constantly at the beach, sipping beers, tossing shrimp on the Barbie, and living one endless summer. For many Americans, it feels like Australians don't work. They just surf, grill, and party under the sun. Now, while Australians do enjoy their beaches and barbecues, it's not a 24/7 lifestyle. In reality, Aussies have one of the highest rates of working hours among developed nations, with busy urban lives that look a lot like New York, Chicago, or Los Angeles. Beaches are for weekends and holidays, not an everyday scene. And here's a surprise. Not all Australians are obsessed with beer. Craft coffee culture in Australia is massive. Melbourne, in particular, is often called the coffee capital of the world. In fact, many Aussies take pride in the quality of their flat whites more than in cheap beer. So while Americans picture backyard BBQs and endless drinking, the truth is closer to bustling cafes, office commutes, and city routines. If you thought Australia was just beaches and BBQs, type "summer" in the comments. And if you're more of a coffee person, drop a teacup emoji. Let's settle this once and for all. But if you think the BBQ myth is funny, wait until you hear the truth about Australians and sports. It's not what Americans expect. Number 7. Sports, surfboards, and kangaroo rides. If you've seen American ads or cartoons about Australia, you've probably spotted the stereotype that every Aussie surfs, plays rugby, or somehow rides a kangaroo to school. It's like Americans think Australia is one big extreme sports park. But here's the reality. Not every Australian is into surfing, or even knows how to surf. In fact, plenty of Aussies have never touched a surfboard in their lives. Sports in Australia are diverse. Cricket, Australian rules, football, soccer, swimming, tennis, and yes, rugby, but participation depends heavily on where you live. Urban areas often have more basketball courts and gyms than surf clubs. And sorry to break the fantasy, but kangaroos are not a form of transport. They're wild animals, and most Australians treat them with the same caution and respect Americans would give to deer or moose. Be real. If you thought Aussies actually ride kangaroos, type "oops" in the comments. If not, tell me which Aussie sport you'd actually try first. But here's where it gets really interesting. While Americans see Australians as fun-loving, carefree, beach and sports fanatics, they often miss the deeper layers of Australian society. This one might be the biggest myth of all, the idea that Australians are permanently laid back, never stressed, and totally carefree. Americans love to imagine Aussies as smiling beachgoers who don't worry about anything serious, but that's only part of the picture. Yes, Australians have a reputation for humor and a relaxed attitude, but behind that is a society full of debate, activism, and challenges. Australia wrestles with complex issues: climate change, bushfire recovery, indigenous rights, and debates about national identity. Far from being chill 24/7, Australians protest, campaign, and fight hard for change. They're not just background extras in a surfing movie, they're engaged citizens in a country with real struggles and triumphs. The laid-back stereotype is fun, but it hides the fact that Australians can be some of the most outspoken and passionate people when it comes to causes they believe in. It's not just sunshine and beaches, it's also resilience, determination, and grit. Let's flip the script. What's one stereotype people have about your country that isn't true? Drop it in the comments, and let's compare notes. Americans love the idea that Australians are permanently chill, barefoot, laughing, never stressed, living the easy life. It's a fun picture, but it's not the whole truth. Yes, Aussies have a sense of humor and a relaxed vibe, but when it comes to real issues, they're anything but passive. Australia has seen some of the world's largest climate protests. Indigenous rights movements have drawn huge national debates. And when bushfires tore across the country, Australians weren't just laid back. They were organizing, fundraising, and fighting on the front lines. The myth of the carefree Aussie hides the grit and determination that actually define the culture. Laid back? Sometimes. But disengaged? Not even close. Quick thought. What stereotype do people have about your country that drives you crazy? Drop it in the comments so we can compare. But that's not the only misconception. Many Americans also think Australia is some far-off land, totally cut off from the rest of the world. For some reason, Americans often picture Australia as this remote, lonely island floating in the Pacific, with nothing but kangaroos and boomerangs to keep it company. But here's the reality. Australia is one of the most globally connected nations on Earth. It's a key player in trade with Asia, it's home to thriving tech hubs, and its pop culture spreads worldwide. From actors like Margot Robbie and Chris Hemsworth to musicians like Sia and the Kid Laroi, Australia's influence is everywhere. And let's not forget, millions of tourists and students flow in and out every year. It's far from isolated. The irony? Some Australians joke that it's Americans who are isolated, since so many never own a passport. Meanwhile, Aussies are some of the world's most frequent travelers, always hopping across to Asia, Europe, or the States. Be honest, have you ever thought of Australia as cut off from the world? Type guilty if so. But there's another myth that's just as funny. The idea that Australia is basically just a sunny version of the US. Some Americans think visiting Australia is like visiting America 2.0, same culture just with kangaroos and beaches. But in reality, the two countries are worlds apart. Healthcare? Australia has universal healthcare, which shocks many Americans who visit. Gun laws? Australia's strict regulations make it one of the safest countries in the world. Even the political system is completely different. It's a constitutional monarchy with compulsory voting. And daily life has its own unique quirks, from Aussie rules football to national holidays like Anzac Day, which carry deep cultural weight. Sure, there are similarities: English language, Hollywood movies, fast food chains, but assuming Australia is just America with an accent erases what makes it unique. If you've ever traveled somewhere that felt totally different from what you expected, comment the country name below. I'm curious which ones surprised you the most. And finally, one of the most damaging stereotypes of all, the idea that Australia is made up of just one kind of people. Perhaps the most misleading misconception is that Australia is only full of blonde, white, surf-loving Aussies. That couldn't be further from the truth. First, Australia is home to the world's oldest continuous culture, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who have lived there for over 60,000 years. Their traditions, art, and stories form the true foundation of the land. Ignoring that history is like erasing the soul of the country. Second, modern Australia is one of the most multicultural nations in the world. Nearly one-third of Australians were born overseas, with massive communities from Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. Walk through Sydney or Melbourne and you'll hear dozens of languages and smell food from every corner of the globe. So the stereotype of one type of Aussie not only misses reality, it overlooks the richness that actually defines the country. Quick challenge: if your city is multicultural too, drop your favorite food from another culture in the comments. Let's see which cuisine takes over the thread. So, let's bring it all together. Americans picture Australia as down under, crawling with deadly animals, endless outback deserts, crocodiles at every doorstep, slang-slinging surfers, BBQ fanatics, laid back to the point of laziness, cut off from the world, basically America's twin, and full of just one kind of person. But the truth is richer, stranger, and more fascinating. Australia is urban, diverse, globally connected, and shaped by deep history. Its wildlife is unique, but not the horror show the internet makes it out to be. Its people are passionate, outspoken, and far more varied than the stereotypes allow. And maybe that's the bigger lesson. Stereotypes flatten the world while reality makes it come alive. The next time you hear a cliché about another country, ask yourself, is it really true? Or is it just another myth waiting to be busted? If this video surprised you, smash that like button, hit subscribe for more myth-busting around the world, and share this with a friend who still thinks kangaroos deliver the mail. And don't forget, comment your country and the biggest myth people always get wrong about it. Because the truth, the world is way more interesting than the stories we tell about it.